The candy bowl was still full when they found the house. Porch lights blazing, front door swinging open in the October wind, and inside the TV playing cartoons to an empty living room. No signs of struggle, no screams registered by neighbors, just the soft sound of dry leaves scraping across asphalt and that orange glow from jack-o'-lanterns that seemed to watch everything in silence. Sheriff Dalton stood in the doorway for a full minute before stepping inside the Morrison house. He'd grown up in Coldwater Springs, knew every street, every family, every secret whispered at the Main Street diner. But this was different. This had the smell of something that didn't belong in this small Pennsylvania town, where everybody knew each other by first name and doors rarely got locked, even on regular nights. But this wasn't a regular night. It was Halloween, and in Coldwater Springs, Halloween always brought with it an invisible weight that hung over the streets like thick fog. 24 hours earlier, everything seemed normal. Sarah Morrison was decorating the porch with fake cobwebs and papier-mâché ghosts, while her 8-year-old son Danny tested his astronaut costume for the 5th time that afternoon. Sarah was a teacher at the local elementary school, one of those people everyone loved, always with a kind smile and homemade cookies for the neighbors. Her husband Tom had left early for his night shift at the paper mill on the outskirts of town, like he did every Tuesday for 10 years. It was a predictable routine, safe, the kind of life people searched for when they ran from big cities. Danny was too excited to sleep, talking non-stop about how many houses he'd hit, whether Mrs. Henderson would give out those giant chocolate bars again, whether he'd be brave enough to go up to the Brennan house at the end of the street, that grey Victorian with windows always dark that nobody had visited in years. If you've ever lived in a small town like this, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That one house everyone avoids without clear reason, where kids cross the street before walking past, where adults make nervous jokes but never look directly for too long. Sarah had promised Danny this would be the year. They'd go together, climb those cracked steps of the Brennan house, ring that rusted doorbell, and Danny would prove to himself there was nothing to fear. Just an old house with a reclusive owner who probably wouldn't even answer. At 6 in the evening, when the sky started darkening with that deep purple shade only October can produce, Sarah and Danny walked out the front door. She carried an old flashlight, one of those yellow plastic ones with batteries that rattle when you shake it. Danny held his fabric pumpkin bag with both hands, already imagining the weight of candy he'd bring home. Neighbors waved from porches. Mrs. Chen took a picture of them with her Polaroid camera, saying Danny looked adorable, that he should be careful not to float off to space. Laughter, casual conversation, the distant sound of music from some teenage party 2 streets over. They started at the Patterson house, then the Kowalskis, the Hendersons, as predicted with the giant chocolate bars, the Santos family with their elaborate decorations that included a fog machine and the sound of chains dragging. Danny was beaming, his bag getting heavier with each stop. Sarah took photos with her old phone, that flip model that still worked perfectly fine, despite everyone saying she should upgrade. She liked the simplicity, the way things used to be before everyone got glued to screens all the time. Around 8 o'clock, they'd covered 4 full streets, and Danny's bag was nearly full. The street started emptying as families returned home, porch lights switching off one by one, like candles being slowly blown out. That's when Danny looked up and saw the Brennan house at the top of the gentle hill at the end of Maple Street. The house stood out against the night sky, its angular silhouette and pointed roof creating an image that looked pulled from an old postcard, the kind you find in dusty boxes at garage sales. The windows were dark, as always, but there was something different that night. A single orange light flickered weakly in one of the second-floor windows, irregular, like a candle fighting a draft. Sarah felt something tighten in her chest, a hesitation she couldn't name. But Danny was already pulling her hand, excited, his words coming fast and eager. They'd promised, she'd promised, and he'd been brave all night. How could she refuse now? Tell me in the comments if you've ever had that feeling, that moment where every instinct screams at you to turn back, but you keep going anyway because promises matter, because you don't want your kid to see fear in your eyes. They started up the sloped sidewalk, leading to the Brennan house. The concrete steps had cracks where invasive grass grew in rebellious tufts. The iron handrail was cold to the touch, so frozen that Sarah almost let go. The air felt different here, thicker, loaded with the smell of rotting leaves and something else, something metallic she couldn't identify. Danny squeezed her hand tighter but said nothing, his silent courage making him seem older than his 8 years. They reached the porch, and the wood planks groaned under their feet, a long, mournful sound like a sigh. The front door was dark oak with elaborate carvings that had faded with time, and a bronze knocker shaped like a crow with open wings. Sarah raised her hand to press the doorbell, but before her fingers reached the button, the door opened by itself. Not with a dramatic creak, not with a sudden bang, but slow and deliberate, as if someone on the other side had been waiting for exactly this moment. The darkness inside the house was absolute, so dense that Sarah's flashlight beam seemed to die at the entrance, unable to penetrate more than a few inches. Danny stepped back, bumping into his mother's legs. Sarah felt her heart race, but forced a smile, saying out loud, maybe too loud, that it must be an automatic mechanism, one of those modern Halloween decorations that detect motion. Her voice sounded hollow, even to her own ears. That's when they heard the voice. It came from inside the house, deep and rough, but somehow also distant, as if echoing through a long hallway. 3 simple words that made Sarah's blood freeze. "Come in, please." There was nothing threatening in the tone, nothing obviously wrong with the words themselves, but the way they were said, the weight behind them, carried an authority that seemed impossible to refuse. Danny looked up at his mother, his eyes wide behind the plastic visor of his astronaut costume. Sarah should have grabbed his hand right then, should have turned and descended those cracked steps as fast as possible, should have trusted that primal instinct every human possesses, that silent alarm that rings when something is fundamentally wrong. But she didn't. Because we're polite, because we're civilized, because years of social conditioning teach us that refusing an invitation is rude, that running without apparent reason is paranoia, that irrational fear has no place in rational adult minds. So Sarah Morrison took a deep breath, squeezed Danny's hand, and took a step across the threshold of the Brennan house door. The temperature dropped immediately, not gradually, but as if they'd crossed an invisible wall into a giant refrigerator. Her breath became visible in white clouds. The flashlight flickered once, twice, then steadied, illuminating a narrow hallway with faded floral wallpaper and a dark red carpet runner leading deeper into the house. The hallway seemed to stretch far beyond what should be physically possible given the house's external dimensions. Sarah knew old Victorian houses could have deceiving layouts, but this was different. This defied basic geometry in a way that made her head hurt when she tried to think about it. Framed photographs covered the walls on both sides, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, as her eyes adjusted to the gloom. Faces stared out from the frames, serious formal expressions of the type you see in 19th century daguerreotypes, but there was something wrong with the eyes. All of them seemed to follow her movement, no matter what angle she looked from. And in some of the photos, she could swear the mouths curved into subtle smiles that hadn't been there a second before. Danny hadn't let go of her hand, his small fingers gripping hers hard enough to hurt. They moved forward slowly, hesitant steps on the thick carpet that muffled any sound. The voice called again, closer now, coming from somewhere at the end of the hallway where the darkness seemed thicker, more solid. "Come, come, there is much to see." Sarah wanted to call back, ask who was speaking, where the owner of the house was, but her throat was dry and the words died before forming. They reached the end of the hallway, where it opened into a large room that must be the living room. Furniture covered with white sheets was arranged like silent ghosts. An enormous fireplace dominated one wall, but there was no fire, just cold ashes and the smell of old smoke that penetrated everything. And then Sarah saw him. In the farthest corner of the room, standing perfectly still, was a figure. It was approximately the size of a man, wearing a dark, antiquated suit, arms hanging relaxed at its sides. But where a face should be, there was only smooth white. It wasn't wearing a mask. There were no features obscured by shadows, just an empty oval surface where human features should exist. Pure white, like porcelain, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, not even the suggestion of where these things might have been. What would you do in that moment? Would you scream, run, or freeze, trying to make your brain process something that shouldn't exist? Sarah couldn't move. Every muscle in her body locked simultaneously. Danny made a small, choked sound. Not exactly a scream, more like all the air leaving his lungs at once. The figure didn't move, but somehow, impossibly, Sarah knew it was looking directly at them. She could feel the weight of invisible attention, intense and penetrating like needles pressing against her skin. Seconds passed, or maybe minutes. Time had become strange and elastic in that room. And then the figure spoke, and Sarah realized with growing horror that the voice came from the smooth white surface where a mouth should be, forming words without movement, without opening. Just sound vibration emerging from nowhere. "You came for trick or treat," the voice said, and there was something wrong with the intonation, as if each word was a separate recording stitched together. The pauses not quite right, the emphasis falling on wrong syllables. "You came, and now you must choose." Sarah finally found her voice, shaking and thin, unrecognizable. Found what sounded like courage from somewhere deep, that mother instinct that overrides fear when your child is in danger. "We need to go," she said, the words coming in a rush. "It was a mistake to come in. Sorry to bother you, but we need to go now." She started backing up, pulling Danny with her, but her feet wouldn't move. She looked down and saw with rising terror that the red carpet had wrapped around her ankles like fingers, holding her in place. Danny was trapped too, his small hands pulling at her leg. Silent tears running down his face. The figure took a step forward, and the sound was all wrong. Not the thump of shoes on wood, but something wet and dragging that made Sarah's stomach turn. "The rules must be followed," the voice continued, that artificial, displaced tone making each word seem like a threat. "You entered my house on Halloween. You accepted the invitation. Now you must play the game, or the game plays you." Sarah felt something break inside her, that fragile layer of rationality keeping her functioning. She started screaming, really screaming, years of civility and decorum falling away as pure terror took over. The room's windows exploded with light, not from inside but outside, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. Voices, multiple voices calling their names. "Sarah, Danny, where are you?" The carpet released her ankles suddenly, and she fell backward, pulling Danny against her. The figure didn't move, but somehow seemed farther away now, receding into shadows without actually taking steps. Sarah turned and ran, stumbling over covered furniture, her shoulder slamming against a doorframe, Danny sobbing in her arms. They burst through a door, not the one they'd entered through, but another, emerging into the cold night air that had never felt so sweet, so necessary, so absolutely vital. Flashlight beams found them immediately, hands grabbed them. Voices asked urgent questions she couldn't process. Sheriff Dalton was there, and Mrs. Chen and maybe a dozen other neighbors, all with flashlights and expressions of panic and relief fighting across their faces. "Are you okay? My God, we've been searching everywhere. How long were you in there?" Sarah couldn't speak, couldn't form coherent words. Danny was shaking violently against her, his small body racked with sobs. They were led down the hill, wrapped in blankets someone had brought, placed in the back seat of the sheriff's cruiser where the heater blew warm air that slowly, very slowly, began to penetrate the cold that seemed to have settled in their bones. "How long were you in there, Sarah?" Sheriff Dalton asked again, his voice gentle but insistent. Sarah looked at him, at his familiar face with those deep wrinkles around the eyes, at the badge he'd worn since before Danny was born. "Maybe 20 minutes, she whispered. "Maybe half an hour?" Dalton exchanged a look with Mrs. Chen, who stood outside the car. "Sarah," he said carefully, "you've been missing for 4 hours. If this happened in your town, would you believe it? Or would you think it's just another Halloween story told by scared people who let imagination take over? 4 hours. Impossible." Sarah looked at the digital clock on the car's dashboard, saw the numbers glowing green, and her stomach sank. It was past midnight. They'd entered the Brennan house around 8. But she could swear on her son's life that they hadn't been there more than a few minutes. 10 at most. How could 4 hours have simply vanished? Danny finally spoke, his voice small and broken. He had no face, Mom. The man had no face. Dalton crouched beside the car, his expression serious. What man, Danny? Did someone hurt you? He seemed genuinely concerned, but there was also something else in his eyes, something Sarah couldn't identify. Fear? Recognition? Before Danny could answer, Tom arrived running, having been called from his shift at the factory, his face pale and eyes wide. He pulled Sarah and Danny into a crushing hug, questions pouring from him in a steady stream that nobody tried to answer. They were taken to the hospital in Millbrook, the bigger town 20 miles away. Tests were done, blood drawn, clinical questions asked by doctors with neutral expressions who'd seen too much to startle easily. But Sarah saw the way they looked at the results, the way they whispered in corners when they thought she wasn't paying attention. Both their core body temperatures were low, too low, mild hypothermia, despite having been outside for only seconds before being found. There were marks on their ankles, red rough impressions that looked like friction burns, but when photographed under special light, showed patterns that didn't match any known material. And the blood tests showed something the doctors couldn't explain, something that made them call specialists from Pittsburgh, then Philadelphia, each one more baffled than the last. The melatonin levels in their systems were drastically elevated, the kind of levels you'd see in someone deprived of sunlight for weeks or months, not hours. But it was impossible. Everything was impossible, and yet the numbers didn't lie. Sarah and Danny were kept overnight for observation. Then another night, then a third, while more tests were done. Tom stayed with them the whole time, sleeping in an uncomfortable chair, getting coffee he didn't drink, just to have something to do with his hands. Danny barely spoke, just stared at the wall with that empty look children shouldn't have. That look Sarah had seen in documentaries about war veterans and trauma survivors. When they were finally discharged and returned to Coldwater Springs, the town had changed. Or maybe they had changed, and the town just looked different through new eyes. People stared when they passed, not openly, but those quick sideways glances they thought were discreet but never were. Conversation stopped when Sarah entered the grocery store, resuming only after she passed with forced laughter that was too bright. At school, teachers treated Danny with exaggerated gentleness that was somehow worse than if they'd been cruel. The other children kept their distance, not from meanness, but from that instinctive fear children have of things they don't understand, things that make them question the safety of their world. There's always that one person who says, "I saw something that night." If you've ever heard a story like that, you know the look in their eyes, that look that says they saw something that changed everything. Mrs. Chen was the first to approach Sarah 3 weeks after that Halloween night. She showed up at the door with a casserole covered in aluminum foil and that determined expression old people have when they've decided something needs saying, regardless of how uncomfortable it might be. They sat at the kitchen table, and Mrs. Chen told Sarah something she'd never mentioned before, something the town had decided long ago to forget. In 1973, another child had disappeared on Halloween, a 9-year-old boy named Michael Brennan, grandson of the man who then lived in the house at the top of Maple Street. The boy had gone out trick-or-treating and never came back. Searches were organized, flyers printed, the FBI finally called. But no trace of Michael Brennan was found. No clothes, no shoes, nothing. As if he'd simply ceased to exist. His grandfather, old James Brennan, had gone out every night for months afterward, walking the streets with a flashlight, calling his grandson's name until his voice went hoarse. And then one night the following spring, he just stopped going out. People said he'd gone mad with grief, that he spent days sitting in the darkness of his house, that sometimes they could hear him talking to someone who wasn't there. He died 5 years later, alone in that house, and it took 3 days for anyone to notice. But here's what Mrs. Chen didn't tell the police in 1973. what she'd kept to herself all these years, for fear they'd call her crazy. She'd seen something that Halloween night when Michael disappeared. She was on the porch smoking a cigarette, something her husband disapproved of, so she only did it late at night when he was asleep. And she saw a figure walking up the hill toward the Brennan house. But it wasn't old James. It was someone tall wearing a dark suit, and when the moonlight caught it at a certain angle, she saw, or thought she saw, that where its face should be there was only smooth white. She blinked, thinking it was her old eyes playing tricks, and when she looked again, the figure had vanished. Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her. "You saw the same thing," she whispered. 50 years ago, you saw the same thing." Mrs. Chen nodded slowly, her old hands trembling around the teacup Sarah had given her. "There's something in that house," she said. "Something that was there before James Brennan, before any of us." This land, this specific land where that house sits, the natives who lived here first had a name for it. They wouldn't build anything there, wouldn't plant anything there. They said it was a door, a place where things from the other side could pass through when conditions were right. And one night a year, on a night when the veil is thinnest, that door opens. Sarah wanted to dismiss it, wanted to laugh and call it old people superstition and urban legends. But she'd been in that house, had seen the faceless figure, had lost 4 hours that her body remembered, even if her mind couldn't access it. So she asked the only question that mattered. What happened to Michael Brennan? Mrs. Chen looked away, out the kitchen window where autumn leaves fell in lazy spirals. "Some people say he's still in that house," she said softly. "Trapped in between, not quite alive, but not quite dead either. They say sometimes you can hear him calling from the second-floor window, begging for someone to let him out. But I've never seen anyone brave enough to go back there and check." That night, after Tom and Danny were asleep, Sarah lay awake staring out the bedroom window. From there, she could partially see the top of Maple Street, where the Brennan house stood against the night sky. And as she watched, she saw a light come on in the second-floor window, that same flickering orange light she'd seen on Halloween. And for just a moment, just a fraction of a second before she forced herself to look away, she thought she saw a small silhouette in that window, the size of a child, pressing hands against the glass. Months passed. Winter came with its whitewashed quiet, snow covering Coldwater Springs like a shroud. Danny slowly began returning to himself, though Sarah noticed he never played alone anymore, always demanding someone be in the same room, always checking the doors were locked even during the day. She took him to therapists, each one using different words for the same thing: trauma, dissociation, post-traumatic stress disorder. They prescribed medications she didn't give him, couldn't give him, because how could a pill fix what had been broken by something reality said couldn't exist? Tom wanted to move, start over in another town, another state, anywhere but here. But Sarah couldn't. Because deep inside herself, in a place she rarely examined too closely, she knew that moving wouldn't change anything. Whatever had happened in that house had created a connection, an invisible thread that stretched across distance and time. She could feel it sometimes, especially at night, especially when she was alone, a gentle pull somewhere behind her sternum, as if something was trying to tune into her frequency. And then the second Halloween came. Sarah had promised herself they'd do nothing, stay inside with lights off, pretend they weren't home when kids came to ring the doorbell. But Danny asked, begged with those big serious eyes, said he wanted to be normal again, wanted just one night where he could pretend nothing had changed. So she agreed, as long as they stayed within 3 blocks of their house. As long as they came back before it got completely dark. As long as they never, ever walked up Maple Street. They left at 5 in the afternoon, early, when there was still enough light to see clearly. Danny wore a superhero costume this time, nothing with helmets or masks that blocked his vision. Sarah carried her new cell phone, the one Tom had insisted she get, with speed dial to Sheriff Dalton programmed in. They visited the same houses as always, got the same candy, heard the same jokes. Everything was going well, was going perfectly. And Sarah started to relax, started to think maybe they could get past this, that maybe time really did heal all wounds. But then, as they walked down Elm Street toward their own house, Danny stopped suddenly, his head tilted to the side, as if listening to something Sarah couldn't hear. And then he started walking, not toward their house, but in the opposite direction, toward Maple Street, toward the house at the top of the hill. Sarah grabbed him, knelt in front of him, held his shoulders and looked into his eyes. "Danny, no," she said firmly. "We promised. We're never going there again." But Danny wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on something beyond her, and when Sarah turned to follow his gaze, she saw the figure. It stood at the end of the street, exactly where Elm Street met Maple. Even at a distance, even in the fading twilight, she could see that smooth white surface where a face should be. And as she watched, horrified and paralyzed, the figure slowly, deliberately raised one hand and waved. Not a friendly wave, but something more formal, more ceremonious, like a judge summoning someone to court. Danny started walking again, and this time when Sarah tried to hold him, he pushed her away with a strength he shouldn't possess, his small body suddenly moving with purpose and determination that weren't his own. She screamed for help, her voice shrill and desperate in the afternoon quiet. Doors opened, people came running, but everything was happening too slowly, as if moving through molasses. Danny reached the figure, and Sarah saw with absolute clarity the faceless thing bend down and place a hand on her son's shoulder. And then they both simply weren't there anymore. They didn't disappear in a cloud of smoke, didn't fade gradually, just ceased to exist in that space between one blink and the next. Sarah ran to the spot where they'd been, fell to her knees, her hands passing through the grass as if she could find some invisible opening, some portal they'd crossed through. But there was nothing, just ground and grass, and the last rays of sunlight dying against the asphalt. People surrounded her, pulled her up, tried to get her to speak, to explain what had happened. But how could she explain what she'd just seen? How could she make them understand that her son had been taken by something that shouldn't exist, to a place that couldn't be real? Sheriff Dalton arrived within minutes, and this time there was no confusion in his eyes, no questions about what might have happened. He'd seen this before 50 years ago, and the look on his face told Sarah everything she needed to know. He knew, the whole town knew. They'd always known that something lived in that house, something that came out one night a year when the veil between worlds grew thin enough to tear. And they'd let her walk up there anyway, let her take her son to that door, because what else could they do? Tell her the truth and sound insane? Warn her about monsters and portals and things that fed on children's souls? The search began immediately. State police, FBI agents, search dogs, thermal cameras, everything that modern law enforcement could throw at a missing child case. They tore through the Brennan house, ripped up floorboards, knocked down walls, searched the basement and attic and every crawl space they could find. But there was nothing. No hidden rooms, no secret passages, no trace of Danny or the faceless figure or anything that couldn't be explained by decades of dust and decay. The house was just a house, empty and old and completely, impossibly ordinary, but Sarah knew better. She'd been inside when it wasn't just a house, when it was something else, something that existed in layers of reality that human senses couldn't fully perceive. And somewhere in those layers, in that space between what is and what shouldn't be, her son was trapped. Just like Michael Brennan had been trapped 50 years ago. Just like how many others before him, going back to when this land was young and the people who first lived here knew enough to avoid this cursed ground. The weeks became months, the official search was called off, and slowly, painfully, Coldwater Springs tried to return to normal. But Sarah couldn't move on. Every night she stood at her window, watching that second-floor light in the Brennan house flicker on and off. Sometimes she swore she could see two small silhouettes now, two children pressing their hands against the glass, calling out to a world that could no longer hear them. Tom tried to get her help, tried to get her to see therapists, to take medication, to accept that Danny was gone, and that whatever had happened was beyond their understanding or control. But late at night, when Tom was asleep and the house was silent, Sarah would slip out the back door and walk up Maple Street. She'd stand in front of the Brennan house, feeling that pull in her chest grow stronger, hearing whispers in a language she didn't know but somehow understood. The voice still called to her, that deep, rough voice that formed words without a mouth. "Come in," it said. "Come in and play the game. Your son is waiting. Your son needs you. Just cross the threshold one more time and everything can be together again." And Sarah wanted to. God help her, she wanted to walk through that door, wanted to find Danny wherever he was, wanted to bring him home or join him in that space between worlds if that's what it took. But something held her back, some last thread of survival instinct or maybe just cowardice, she couldn't tell which. Because deep down, she knew that if she crossed that threshold again, if she accepted that invitation, there would be no coming back. She'd become another silhouette in the window. Another lost soul trapped in the Brennan house, and 1 year from now on Halloween night, the faceless figure would walk down Maple Street looking for its next guest. The porch light was still on when they found the house. That's how this story started, remember? With Sheriff Dalton standing in the Morrison doorway, looking at a TV playing cartoons to an empty room, at a candy bowl still full, at a door swinging in the October wind. Because Sarah did finally cross that threshold. On the third Halloween, exactly 2 years after Danny was taken, she walked up those cracked steps one last time. She didn't tell Tom, didn't leave a note, didn't say goodbye. She simply waited until midnight when the veil was thinnest, and she went to bring her son home. They found her house empty the next morning. The TV was on, the candy bowl full, the door open. But Sarah was gone. And if you drive through Coldwater Springs on Halloween night, if you're brave enough or foolish enough to go up Maple Street to where the old Brennan house still stands, you might see 3 silhouettes in the second-floor window now. 2 children and a woman, pressing their hands against the glass, watching the trick-or-treaters pass by below, waiting for the next person to accept the invitation, to play the game that never ends. The town doesn't talk about it anymore. They've learned that some stories are better left untold, some questions better left unasked. But every Halloween, without fail, Sheriff Dalton parks his cruiser at the bottom of Maple Street, and he doesn't let anyone go past that point. Not families, not teenagers on dares, not curious outsiders who've heard the rumors. Because he knows what waits at the top of that hill. He's always known. And he carries that weight, that guilt, knowing he could have stopped it, could have warned them, could have done something before 3 more souls were added to whatever collection the faceless thing keeps in that house between worlds. So what do you think really happened that night? Was it real or just a story small towns tell themselves to explain the unexplainable? Share your theory in the comments. And if stories like this make your skin crawl, if they make you look twice at the old houses in your neighborhood, then hit subscribe. Because there's another story coming soon, and it might be closer than you think. It might be happening right now, in a town just like yours, on a street that looks just like the one you live on. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone invites you inside on Halloween night, you'll remember the Morrisons, and you'll have the courage to say no.